With world grain and oilseed markets navigating a web of geopolitical tensions, shifting weather patterns and evolving trade dynamics, the spotlight is once again on tariff talks, crop conditions and speculative positioning. Today I'm joined by VP of Clearing and Execution Sales, Bertrand Oesterle. Thank you for joining us, Bert. So any progress from tariff talks as far as grains and oilseeds are concerned?
So there's been some success for the Trump administration. There's been a second larger deal with the Vietnamese agreeing to buy some $2 billion worth of US farm products. So that goes after the first success that we had heard about with the US-UK trade deal. That has created a lot of discussions in the UK in the sense that that deal was bringing potentially more ethanol export from the US into the UK, and we've had Vivergo, one of the largest plants in the UK, lobbying back the government to say this is a disaster, our plant is going to shut, it's 1 to 1.2 million tons of demand that we're not going to have in the UK. It's going to affect the farming industry, especially in the northern part of the UK. So it's been very much about this smaller bits, so Vietnam, the UK, and then there's the elephant in the room, which is obviously US-China. So Trump had a discussion last week with President Xi. The discussion went somehow well, and it was followed up this week by discussions and meetings in London between China and the US. So we're hearing that it's going well, that they are planning to make sure that we don't have any more tariff tantrums or decisions which would be rash. And in a way, from an oilseed point of view, it's quite interesting for us, because it's about reopening the Chinese door to US soybean exports. And when we look at the May data, and the May data is very blatantly against the US. The Chinese have imported 13.92 million tons of soybean in May. It's a record for the month of May. It's up from 6.08 last month. And when you compare to the exports from Brazil, it's 14.1 million tons. So it doesn't take a genius to understand that the US represented a tiny, minuscule portion in that record soybean import in May.
And last week you were talking about good US crop progress. Has it continued since then?
It's been very decent over the past week. So there's been mixed weather. Some areas were not getting the rain, some areas were getting too much rain, but generally speaking, it's continuing to be favorable in the US. US corn is 97% planted, soybean is 90% planted. And in terms of good to excellent ratings, those excellent ratings are increasing. We've got a good to excellent rating in corn of about 71%, which is up 2% from the previous week. In soybean, it's 68%, up 1%. In winter wheat, 54%, up 2%. And in spring wheat, it's 53%, up 2% as well. So far, it's been favorable.
And beyond the US, is there any fundamental news that's worth noting?
So if I look at the rest of the world, there's mostly bearish elements coming as well to the market. We've had in Argentina the Rosario Grain Exchange stating that they see better yields than anticipated for soybean. That crop is very advanced in terms of harvesting. We're towards the end of it. The end part is a bit slow, but it's better yielding. And then when we look next door in Brazil, ELSEG put out a report this week stating that they see for the second safrinha corn crop, so the larger Brazilian crop, record density, crop density, and in that case it means that potentially we could have better yields, better production estimates. But again, that harvest is slow to reassure the bulls in a way. It's 2 to 3% harvested. It's below the 10% achieved at that time last year. And when we go into wheat, there's also been news from Russia, with Sovecon increasing its wheat production estimate for the new crop in Russia from 81 to 82.8 million tons. Interestingly, also, we've had the first rate cut in Russia from 21 to 20%. That's the first rate cut since 2022. And that, in a way, takes away some of the cost of financing for farmers. Then in Europe, the Bulgarians and the Romanians are telling us that it's going pretty well. The Romanians are throwing some figures out which are absolutely amazing: 13 to 15 million tons in wheat production. That would be a new record if we got to the 14-15 million ton mark, and that's way over the 9.29 achieved last year. To go back to Argentina, the wheat crop is about a quarter planted already. So a lot of very good news, therefore bearish news coming from the production side, but also the consumer side is slightly roaring for the bulls and for the producers, in the sense that we hear that Morocco and Tunisia might have a much better crop than last year, some 40% up potentially. So that means less import demand. And the bears are pushing on that point, saying it could also be the case for Egypt and Iraq. The procurement in wheat domestically has been pretty solid, and therefore it may mean also a lesser import requirement.
And so I guess the funds specs have no incentive then to short cover.
So far, no, and that's pretty correct from your part. We've seen the specs remaining very short, and I'm going to take the figures for Paris from last Wednesday. We're going to have an update later today, and the figures for the US from last Friday. So in wheat, Chicago, the specs overall are short 91,000 lots. In wheat, the specs are short in Paris of 258,000 lots. But when we look at the fund position, it's very close to a short of 300,000 lots. It's 298K. In corn, the specs are short overall 270,000 lots in Chicago, and in soybean, short 30,000. So a bit less short in soybean because we've got that US-China talk, so the specs are a bit cautious in case there's a deal. But generally speaking, the specs are short almost everything. And when we look at Paris wheat, we still look at the SEPDEC as a barometer as to when the spec roll could occur. We still believe that the spec roll is not going to take place before the end of July to mid-August, because we've got the option expiry on September Paris wheat on the 15th of August. And being so short, the bulls are looking at what could trigger a short covering rally. And it is getting interesting because in Paris wheat, we've seen the September wheat being completely hammered yesterday and today. We've gone through the 200 mark. Yesterday we made a low of 198.50. Today we've already made a low of 198, a new contract low. It's completely disastrous for farmers in Western Europe because it's way below cost of production. But we're seeing farmers being clever by selling the cash crop that's going to bring them the most treasury, and that's rapeseed currently. So we've seen canola being strong on tight stocks. We've seen soybean being sustained by those US-China trade talks, and we've seen rapeseed being sold on a regular basis. And the only explanation is farmers selling the better crop, putting some cash into treasury to try to hold onto that disastrous wheat crop in hope of a elusive bounce for the time being. And the bulls are trying to make a story out of it, saying when we have the spec roll, if there's no farmers selling, we could have a decent bounce then, but not just yet.
So I was going to say, is there any bullish viewpoint out there? I mean, it can't all be bearish, surely.
Well, there's a bit of bullish elements, but they are, as always, over the past months or so, quickly destroyed by the bears, but there are elements. So first of all, we mentioned a week to 2 weeks ago the Chinese government warning of severe storms and severe flood risk for the northeastern part of China that could have an effect on their corn production. So we have to keep an eye on that from now to August. Then we have a USDA WASDE report tomorrow. When we look at the pre-report estimates, they're not looking like they're going to change much. We might have slightly higher stock corn estimates for the US, or slightly unchanged to higher wheat, corn, soybean stocks worldwide. But what is going to be interesting is the USDA going to react to the Chinese story of the past 2 to 3 weeks when we had that heat event? Is the USDA going to take out some 3.5 to 10 million tons out of Chinese output, Chinese stocks, and therefore reflect that in world wheat stocks or not? We still think it's going to be too early for this month. They probably do it later in the year. But if they start manipulating those figures in Chinese wheat, then it could have a bullish momentum tomorrow. We'll have to keep an eye on that figure specifically. And then the other figure that's going to be interesting for the bulls is the US wheat output estimate. The pre-report estimates are at 1.924 billion bushels, which is higher than the 1.921 last month due to expectations of better yields, especially on the spring wheat side of the US side. But the bulls are looking at how quickly the winter wheat is being harvested, and in the US it's 4% harvested so far. It's below the 11% achieved last year. It's below the 5-year average of 7%, and the bulls are saying, careful, there is some untimely rain in the US, it could affect output, it could affect quality as well. And beyond that, the bulls are trying to shift that story also in Europe by saying that despite Bulgaria, Romania giving us some good figures, parts of France are still very dry, and the conditions, the good to excellent conditions in France have dropped from April to now from 76 to 69%. So the bulls are trying to put that under the magnifying glass, but the bears are destroying that argument by saying it's up from 62% last year, and also overall Europe should be having a 14 to 15 million ton crop. That's better. Also, the bulls have been looking recently at what's going on out of Ukraine. We're hearing today that the spring barley, the spring barley early yields are not so great. We've seen APK Inform and UCA looking at a lower crop output for wheat by about 0.1 million tons, and anything from 2.6 to 3 million tons less in corn compared to previous estimates. So the bulls are saying it's not so rosy in Ukraine, but the bears are again trying to destroy the argument by saying it's so much better in Russia anyway. So we'll have to see tomorrow, I think, the USDA report and see if it changes any of the dynamics.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your insights today. For more videos like this, please do like and subscribe.